This is this next conversation between Khaled Furani and Shai Lavi is one that I'm really grateful for. They both flew in from Tel Aviv for this event. Khaled Furani is a professor of anthropology at Tel-Aviv University on the lands of al-Sheikh Muwannis. He co-edited Inside the Leviathan, Palestinian Experiences at Israel Universities. And his most recent article is Khalifah and the Modern Sovereign, Revisiting a Qur'anic Ideal Within the Palestinian Condition, which came out in 2022. Shai Lavi, who's been a good friend of mine for over 20 years, is director of the Leer Jerusalem Institute and professor of law at Tel-Aviv University. His area of specialization is the sociology of law and legal and political theory, and is the author of The Modern Art of Dying. They're going to have a conversation. Welcome to Khaled and Shai.
Thank you, Roger. And I will take this occasion to express my appreciation for this special invitation, special occasion to you and to Tina, who hears me, I hope, for all the hard work to bring us here. Let's just say a few words by way of opening the conversation, and thank you, the audience, of course, for being here. I come to you today as citizens of two countries, both of which have their own relations to variants of tribalism, cosmopolitanism, to projects of freedom and enslavement. I mean by that the Israeli and the American state, of which I'm a citizen. But I'm no citizen of my nationality as a Palestinian or to the faith tradition from which I'll be speaking from, which is Islam. But I come together with Shai, my dear, dear friend Shai, to think with you, Shai, but hopefully with our audience too, on how to examine and investigate tribalism, cosmopolitanism, and what's beyond them, even though we're not experts. Neither one is an expert of this topic. Can you hear me okay? Okay. But Shai, please.
Thank you again to Roger for making this happen, to Tina and to everyone else here, and especially to Khaled for this ongoing conversation that we've been having. I come from Tel Aviv. I'm an observant Jew. I'm a committed Israeli, which doesn't make me necessarily a proud one in these days, perhaps a sad one in this time. And we will, I hope, have an opportunity to talk about this, about pride and whether it belongs or doesn't belong in our belongings.
Yeah, especially tomorrow we have a session, right, Shai? We welcome you to join us in case you feel the questions today aren't addressed or sufficiently addressed. You're welcome to join us tomorrow for a continued conversation to think about these concepts, and from my position, in a time of annihilation. But we also share, Shai and I, a certain fondness for things we've learned from Frau Arendt, despite some of the foolish things we've heard sometimes from her. And we will hopefully bring that expertise, Shai as a professor of law, me as an anthropologist, into play here in our conversation. So one way to begin this conversation, really, Shai, for us is to address the following question. Allow me to read it out. What are tribalism and cosmopolitanism? Are they transhistorical phenomena or specifically modern constructions?
So I think by way of sort of starting the conversation, getting it going, I think it's best to think about tribalism and cosmopolitanism together as a matrix. And part of what we'll be trying to do is think a little bit about the matrix and think quite a bit outside of the matrix. so let me try and clarify what I mean by this. So that tribalism and cosmopolitanism are just one way of thinking about the real problem at stake. Tribalism is one way of trying to get at the question of our particular belongings, the fact that we belong to bounded groups. And cosmopolitanism is one way to talk about our shared humanity. The fact that the two are juxtaposed and contrasted create a matrix. They already assume a lot about what this relationship is about. And I think what we will be trying to do is, again, try to think a little bit outside of the matrix. So let me just say a few words about what I think is the matrix here, about this relationship between tribalism and cosmopolitanism. We can start with cosmopolitanism. And although the idea is of ancient times, of ancient origins, I think it has a distinctly contemporary sense to it, as it forms in relation to tribalism. And the idea is that in order to be cosmopolitan, you need to move away from your particular belongings, to your particular identities. And somehow cosmopolitanism is a way of transcending those particular belongings, thinking beyond them. And so often it is thought of this move, sort of from tribalism to cosmopolitanism, as some kind of progress of, right, that historical progress, as we've heard in Sebastian's wonderful talk, an evolutionary progress, right? Humanity starts in sort of clans and tribes and moves on to form states, and maybe we could scale up to a cosmopolitan sense, but it's this idea of moving from one and transcending to the other. And what I think is an interesting question to ask is whether this is the only way of thinking about our shared humanity, whether we need to transcend our particular identities, our bounded identities, in order to think about our shared humanity, or whether we can find this shared humanity within our particular commitments. And tribalism is one way of talking about our bonded identities, our bonded commitments, where we come from, but it's not the only way to think about it. I think tribalism assumes a lot about, especially when it's juxtaposed and contrasted with cosmopolitanism, it assumes a certain kind of strong exclusion, a rivalry, the idea that our particular identities trump other commitments, my country, right or wrong. It creates a certain expectations about identity. And so I think that part of what we want to talk about, Khaled, is how to think about these not as contrasts, tribalism versus cosmopolitanism, and maybe not always to use these terms, but to try and look for other ways of thinking about these kinds of commitments that we have, both to our particular belongings and to our shared humanity. And it's in that context, Khaled, that I want to ask you whether you think that sort of turning to tradition, both as a modality of belonging and as a concept or as a resource, whether it can offer us tools, new ways of thinking about this tension, or alleged tension.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Shai. Maybe on an anecdotal note, when I received the kind invitation from Roger, one of the questions was, and allow me to read it out, just to share the experience of reacting to the invitation is, Roger, one of the questions was, or is, how does one navigate dual loyalties of tribal and cosmopolitan identities? And I said, wait a second, why are those dual? Is there an inherent tension, or maybe it's an apparent tension? What happens if we introduce to the conversation the concept of tradition? A concept that could enter our conversation in many, many ways, in multiple ways. Perhaps today we can try to illustrate some of the ways. I can think of 5 or 6 ways, but maybe there are more. But strikingly, it's absent. I was glad today to hear you, Roger, speak of the authority of tradition. Because, in the spirit of Frau Arendt, we would wonder, how would she have looked at this concept, how would you have bracket the whole conversation on this duality to the point where you can wonder, is this assumed tension real, inherent, or rather fictitious? From a particular place of tradition, it's striking. Let me just share with you two observations, Shai. How some of the leading authors on the TC, as Shai call it, Tribalism Cosmopolitanism divide, the TC divide, go into great labor not to use the word tradition. I'm thinking of people like Walzer, I can, if you want, or Nussbaum, or Rule, or Appia. But so even at the level of locution, the word tradition is oddly missing when it could have saved them a lot of economy of prose. So they skirt around it. But that's only symptomatic of a more profound absence of tradition as a concept, as a category even of thought, philosophically speaking. What happens if you live in a tradition that teaches you to belong to the world where the cosmopolitan and the tribal are, as Arendt would say, Janus face-like? You could be both at once. So I don't want to be a party pooper, but thinking with and through the concept of tradition ends up bracketing the whole conversation that could otherwise go a lot deeper. I'm thinking of, and I'll stop here, scripturally, theologically, what if we think there are greater ways of belonging than just either to the tribe or to the cosmopolis? Let me stop here.
So I think part of, also for me, sort of this idea of going back to tradition as a historical construction, as a way of thinking, opens up other possibilities. So, for example, what is it if we don't need to transcend tradition, but rather dig deeper into tradition in order to find our shared humanity? And it's there from the first book of Genesis, right? That there is a sense of a shared humanity as the beginning of the tradition, right? Sort of being created, for example. But this would be only one example, being created in the image of God. But that this is not as some universal, detached, abstract language, but rather this is a language that one finds within the tradition. So rather than moving beyond the tradition to reach cosmopolitanism, one can reach into the tradition in order to find a shared humanity. Or, speaking of evolutionary theory, this idea that the primary commitment is to the tribe. Maybe, but is that what tradition tells us? So in the last piece of bread, who do you give it to? Evolutionary theory may say you give it to your own. Tribe hospitality may suggest that you don't, right? That your primary commitment is not always to yourself, and that commitment is also part of tradition. So what possibilities open when we start thinking about these two not as contrast?
Yeah.
I was, maybe just share an anecdote, because anecdotes are always good. I was sitting on the plane on the way here next to an ultra-Orthodox black hat chassid who is American, born American, but who made Aliyah, emigrated to Israel. And I said to him, why? And he said, what do you mean, why? I said, I'm as I initially said, I'm a committed Israeli. I will be there fighting for a better Israel. But why you, born in America, why would you come? And he said, that's so surprising that you asked this question. All the Israelis I've spoken to are so proud of being Israeli. And it really raised for me a question, and I could have this conversation with him because, in a way, we share the tradition, the specific tradition. I said, in our tradition, pride is a problem, right? It's not necessarily the best. We can say we were blessed for being Jewish, or blessed for the fortunes that we have and the opportunities that we were given. But pride assumes this sense that it's almost a priori that you're on the good side. right? You want to be proud of your children, but that's not the basic relationships that you have to your children. It's something else. It's a certain kind of commitment. Pride can come or not come at a later stage, and you could also have other sort of more judgmental positions towards your country, towards your children. I think just, and
Please.
I think that it's a little bit different when I think of sort of belonging to a tradition. The tradition doesn't often have an outside of it to judge it from if you're really embedded in the tradition. But it gives you tools to think critically and to make the most of the tradition. So it's a different kind of relationship. So I think this is an attempt to open a space for thinking about this.
Yeah. Thank you, Shai. There are two ways, I think, in which maybe our conversation, when we try to bring traditions of inquiry, a moral tradition, or traditions of faith, could expand the conversation, right? Could help us think about this duality of TC. For example, one way to get some resources analytically, conceptually from tradition is to make a distinction, to clarify, which is a task of thinking, to get us less confused about things, is to make a distinction. I've been finding it helpful, Shai, I wonder what you think about it, between being tribal, of a tribe, and tribalism, with an ism at the end, and being cosmopolitan and cosmopolitanism. And I think we do well not to confuse them, not to treat them as though they're one. From my particular position, let's say within the Muslim tradition, and that's where it gets out, to be a citizen of a tribal state, in this case Israel, and yet part of a faith tradition that is very anti-tribalist. And please hear the distinction, anti-tribalist, not anti-tribal. Why do I say this? Because in Islam, for example, the tribe is a recognized fact of human existence. It's accepted. One could even argue it's recognized and given its due honor. But what is problematic is tribalism. One could say similar about cosmopolitanism as an openness to others or to something beyond your most immediate collective. But perhaps cosmopolitanism is no less susceptible to dangers and entrapments. Both of them, those isms, tribalism and cosmopolitanism, could be doing some violence to the boundaries we draw around ourselves. In the first case, tribalism, potentially as a case of deifying the belonging to a group, as a kind of violence itself. While cosmopolitanism is an entrapment in another sense of dissolving those claims to particularity. The rootlessness, as Appia say, that often haunts cosmopolitan feelings and affiliations. So with those, I think, analytical distinctions, allow me just to illustrate, again, anecdotally, biographically, how tradition could be a resource to think through this supposed duality. And the way it can be both limited and limiting. Let me think of one. When I go, for example, to Al-Aqsa Mosque, Al-Haram al-Sharif in Jerusalem, this is just one anecdote. I would be happy to elaborate on others. And I meet a brother or sister in Al-Haram al-Sharif and Al-Aqsa from Jamaica or from India or from London. In what way my faith tradition is bringing me to be part of a cosmopolis? You see how belonging to a tradition is a way of belonging to discover your non-belonging. Because an underlying faith premise, I will say it in Arabic and translate in English, a ubiquitous ayah and maxim even at this point. Anyone with prosaic familiarity with daily life in the Muslim tradition, one may have heard the term "Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi laraji'un." We are from God, and to God we return. We belong to God. Excuse me, that's a better translation. We belong to God, and to God we return. Now, I, as a Muslim, can see how other traditions would phrase it in other ways. If you're Stoic, the word God would be maybe logos, or nature. Okay? But the idea there's even greater difference than the difference of belonging to this group or that group, even the human group. It's the distinction between divine and human, or mortal and immortal. So it's that complexity that I would say, let us not relinquish and give up when we think how tradition can enrich and expand the conversation, where I just try to explain to you how some traditions will push you to think about belonging through the so to speak, non-belonging, that we also learn how we don't belong to this world in some ways. Let me stop here.
So thank you, Khaled. And I want to come back to Al-Aqsa, to the sacred spaces in the conversation. But before we get there, I think that I like the way that you distinguish between a tribe and tribalism, between cosmopolitan and cosmopolitanism. But I think that even the word tribe is used too loosely to talk about so many different things. And I would be weary about that, about sort of this overuse that every belonging becomes, is used, we use the word tribe to describe it. I belong to my family, it's tribal. I belong to my religion, it's a tribe. To my ethnicity, it's tribal. To the soccer group, to the football team. So it's like the way people use religion, right? Judaism is a religion, and Islam is a religion, and Buddhism might be a religion, but then also Marxism is a religion understood in some way, or nationalism can be a religion, and then everything, any strong commitments becomes a religion. I think Arendt talks about this in her piece on authority, on how that's more confusing than helpful. And so I would try and sort of make sure that we know what we're talking about, and that we don't conflate different categories of belonging. And when we soon enter questions of scripture, because I think we want to go into that question of sort of how this question appears in scripture, clearly there is a word of tribe, both in the Muslim tradition and in the Jewish tradition, but they play different roles and in very specific meanings, and we may want to consider those as well. But I want to meet your anecdote about Al-Aqsa with my own and a different one. So there's a place, a section of the Wailing Wall, and some of you may have been there, the Western Wall in Jerusalem, considered by tradition to be a remnant of the temple, where I specifically like to go to, not the one that most go to, but it's a bit secluded, it's separated, it's also co-ed.
Co-ed?
In the sense that women and men can pray there together. But it's usually abandoned. I like to go there Saturday afternoon, sit there on my own, and listen to the mosque. You can hear from there also the mosque. And there's a sense, I think, an interesting sense in which tradition opens this alternative understanding of sort of our shared humanity in that moment, in that context. Obviously, speaking now under very sort of different conditions of the relationship between, in the region. But just bear with me with this in this moment where there's this other possibility that opens, and it is, I, as an observant Jew, can't go up to Temple Mount, precisely because it's sacred. Traditionally, Jews are prohibited from going up to Temple Mount, and the Wailing Wall is where the closest we can come to. So there I'm sitting, the closest that I can to the most sacred place for the Jewish tradition, and it's a shared space. It's a shared space in the sense that I can hear the mosque. It's a space shared also by Islam, and I think it opens a question about a shared humanity or a shared sort of belonging to a sacred space, which doesn't necessarily bring people apart, but also doesn't necessarily transcend the tribal identities. It's precisely from within these traditions that we can see this commonality.
Yeah. Yet, with that point on shared, even though we are cognizant of the ways in which our traditions may meet, but we don't wish to pretend they also diverge, right? Oftentimes, I keep telling Shai, I think of Islam as an internal critique of certain aspects of the Jewish tradition. And it is especially critical of the tribalist tendencies in Judaism, in the sense that the Prophet Muhammad is often described as, is called a Nabi al-Ummi, meaning a prophet for all of humanity, or God. That's one way to think about cosmopolitanism within the scriptures. Another way to think about it is God sending a revelation for all humanity, al-Alamin in Arabic, aw nas in Arabic, all of humanity. And finally, I would like us to go back, for example, how we could look at the paradigm or the story of Abraham, the founder, so to speak, of the tribe, himself taking acts beyond or to go against the tribe. Let me, for example, share with you a verse. I think if there are those who are interested in English, you can find it in Surah 6, verse number 74. I will read it first in Arabic, but we'll do also an improvised translation. وإذ قال إبراهيم لأبيه آزار أتخذ أصناما آلهة إني أراك وقومك في ضلال مبين. And Abraham said to his father, Azar, do you take idols as your gods? I see you, and here's the key word, I see you and your people. Abraham is saying, are your people in great loss, so to speak. And if you can just hear this distinction that Abraham made, he's telling his father, your people, as if he's already placing himself outside his kin. For me, I take this as a message, at least as articulated in the Quran. Yes, one should be proud of one's skin, but let's not make it absolute, and always see how to go and open your eyes to things that are greater than your most greater. Listen to me, not in the value, but in the sense, the claim they can make on your existence. Don't deify any of this. Don't deify any of this. In that sense, Abraham was, it seems to me, was willing to see and recognize of bonds and commitments beyond the tribe. Paradoxically, right? Even though he's a founder and a patriarch.
So I think Khaled raised a very interesting and profound question about the relationship between the traditions. And I want to hold on to that. I'm not sure what to make of it, and so I'm going to also ask you, Khaled, about this. But on its surface, it seems that you're suggesting that there's a critique from the Muslim tradition of the Jewish tradition. And the critique is that somehow the Jewish tradition is more tribal because the revelation was meant for a specific people and not for humanity at large. Something along those lines. And we're familiar with that critique coming also from Christianity. So where Judaism is seen as tribal and the gospel from Paul onwards is meant for the nations. And so I want to think about that and ask you about that, Khaled. But before I do so, I think it's interesting to bring in Abraham because it's helpful to. Yeah. So Abraham in the Jewish tradition, and I think also in Islam, is seen as the father of nations in the plural, not only obviously of the Israelites or the Jewish nation. And his name, Av Hamon Goyim, right? It's transformed. He's born as Avram and turns to Avraham, and this H, the Hey, that's added to his name, is actually to point to his destiny as the father of many nations. So there's, at the beginning, there's already this notion of a plurality. And so I think that there are two ways of thinking about this. One is to think, and this goes with the matrix of tribalism and cosmopolitanism. One way to think about it is that there's some kind of supersessionism, that there's some kind of advance, that there's some kind of story of progress, that you progress from the tribal identity to some universal identity. And I think that this idea of supersessionism is very much characteristic of the Christian relationship, of Christianity's relationship to Judaism, at least traditionally. Things have changed and the doctrines have changed, but initially that somehow Christianity replaces Judaism, that there was a truth of the Old Testament, but there's now a new truth of the New Testament, and that this movement from the particularity of the Jewish tribe to some kind of universal cosmopolitan idea. And sometimes when I hear Khaled speak about Islam, I think it's the same. It's the same, like the Christian critique of Judaism, so too Islam is criticizing Judaism for being particular and the need to go beyond the tribal to something more than that and beyond that. I wonder about that, so maybe I'll just stop and ask you about that.
I guess even though both could be critiques of certain practices of the tradition, of the moral tradition of Judaism, I wouldn't rush to conflate them, even if yes, one can understand the relation between the two, meaning Christianity and Judaism as superseding, one superseding the other. I think Islam is about reverting, telling the Jews, you had a good message, why did you corrupt it, basically? Not there is a wrong message to begin with. It's precisely going back to Abraham, right? In the sense, for those who are familiar with how the story of Abraham is narrated in the Quran, he's looking for something to believe in. At first he looks for I think it's mentioned also in the Torah, it's mentioned where he wonders if the moon is God, if the sun is God, until he finally says, no, these are transient things, it cannot be God. And then which is then God is not something it's what you see in your eyes, in your naked eyes. Where I'm going with this, Shai, is first not to conflate Islamic with Christian critique of Judaism. Each tradition of those two has its own way of self-understanding and self-relating to Judaism. At the very least, Islam recognizes that there is a common shared truth in one and the same God, and that heaven is, that's, if we want to proceed, and I don't suggest necessarily we do this now with the theological, eschatological debate, in Islam, heaven is supposed to be for all, right? It's not about to which kinship or progeny or who is in your heart, whom you believe in. It's about what you do. But let me before we enter put ourselves entirely in a theological polemic, something for which I lack the tools or the interest, let's return back to our starting conversation here on the tribalism and cosmopolitanism, is we just illustrated to you how once you inject tradition into the conversation, it can open up in all kinds of ways. I would want to invite us, Shai, you and me, and maybe the audience, to ask ourselves, what kind of duality is this, tribalism and cosmopolitanism? When did it emerge? How did it emerge? In what ways it is or it isn't a distinctly modern duality? Yes, people have always claimed or staked their claims to a particularity. People have always staked their claims to universality, one could argue. It's not something that modernity has a monopoly over. But could it be also, I wonder, as we think with and through the concept of tradition, could it be also, and in what ways is it, this construct, as a distinctly modern construct, to the extent that it is one, in what ways it's a response to a certain crisis in our existence? To what extent it's emerging from a particular European history? of managing difference, of managing plurality. Because again, what is the difference that matters most implicitly in this formulation? The difference across tribes, the difference across polities, the difference between peoples. But I've been just trying to allude, and maybe more than allude, through the Abrahamic narrative, there's greater differences. Let me put it differently, and I'll stop my answer here. Walter Benjamin, a friend of Frau Arendt, right? To whom she tried to stay loyal more than Adorno and Horkheimer did. I've been privileged to look at their correspondence, the two, Arendt and Benjamin. And he wrote something, I think it's art in the age of mechanical reproduction. I could be wrong. It could be in another essay. But in that essay, he talks about the gods fleeing in the modern age, maybe, I suppose. And all that's left for humans is to observe each other. I'm wondering if this is the product of that flight.
So I want to hear more, Khaled, but maybe sort of share some thoughts, and then you can elaborate a little bit about the way you put it. So I'm struck by the way that we talk about sort of tribalism in our age as identity, as a question of identity, and how we form and shape our identity. And I wonder whether that could be contrasted with more traditional ways of thinking of belonging. So when does our belonging become a question of identity, which I understand, what I hear by identity is as kind of self-fashioning. Right? This is who I am. This is how I present myself. It goes along very well, for example, with ideas of nationalism, right? Sort of self-determination, right? The idea that what's at stake here is for us to determine who we are. And it goes also along with identity politics and other forms where it's really about who I understand myself to be. And I wonder whether this sense of belonging as identity can be contrasted or juxtaposed with other forms of belonging. First of all, those that we don't choose at all, but rather that we're somehow born into. That's one thing. And other that is, I want to say, about non-identity, about being a stranger rather than being one with oneself. So being a stranger in the world, being a stranger to oneself. So what I have in mind specifically is in the context of the Jewish tradition, and Khaled, I'd like to hear also about your thoughts, is this idea that one, right, the Torah commandment not to wrong or oppress the stranger, for you too have been strangers in the land of Egypt. So this question, so that the beginning of the formation of the Israelite people, of the Jewish people, is as strangers in the land. Yeah. And they receive the Torah outside of the land. And so there's this element of sort of being a stranger rather than feeling at home and being at home, implied and embedded in this notion of belonging. And so I wonder...
Viscerally, can I respond viscerally? So there are three things I think might be helpful or relevant. One is a sad comment. How, as a Palestinian, I see oddly Israel as a threat not only to our Palestinian lives and lives elsewhere, Lebanon, elsewhere, also, not just many places beyond the borders of the state, but also I think of it as also a threat to the rich ethical tradition of Judaism. And I think you and I know enough people who have made that point, that a state as a nation state, it itself is an endearment to an ethical inheritance that is Judaism. Two, it harkens back your point on identity, as I'm not able to say anything really with authority on identity as a concept. I don't study it. But I just will raise with you a question. Why is this a duality, foreignness or stranger, and having an identity? Sometimes I just wonder if our preoccupation with identity, perhaps I wonder if it's an effect of a certain modern noise, of loss of identity, of loss of anchoring in the world. Maybe I'm just offering to think about it symptomatically of the crisis of the age. Whence, I ask myself, this massive concern with identity? Does it bespeak a certain unmooring? This is not my answer, this is a question. Again, when does identity become a question? Third, you made me think of a prophetic tradition, a hadith, that I'd like to share with you. I believe I've shared with you because it's been preoccupying me in the context of this conversation. It will shock some of you, but I invite you to the shock, and maybe we can, all of us together, think how to reflect using this prophetic tradition on the categories occupying us today and the experiences. These are not just categories. So Prophet Muhammad has once said that Islam has entered the world as a foreigner or a stranger, and shall return to be a stranger or a foreigner. جاء الإسلام غريبا وسيعود غريبا. And his companions were perplexed, were really confused. What do you mean? Islam has entered the world as a foreigner, as a stranger, and shall return to be so. He said, blessed be the strangers, in response. Blessed be the strangers. And when they asked him, what do you mean by stranger? He said, those who command good and forbid evil. So perhaps foreignness isn't just an identity, but also an ethical stance in the world. And in its secular iteration in the 20th century, we see it perhaps quite famously when Adorno talked in Minima Moralia about it is part of ethics to be, Said was fond of citing it, if someone could help me remember it. Adorno says in this book, Minima Moralia, that it's part of ethics to be a home nowhere. That's when I hear foreignness, think that ultimately you might find yourself on the losing side to take an ethical stance. Think of what it means to defend not only Palestinian laws, but the very idea that all lives matter.
So I think, Khaled, you open a distinction, which I think is an important distinction, not only in the Israeli context, Israel-Palestine context, but I think more broadly about this tension between the Jewish tradition and the state of Israel, between the people and the state. And as an authority, I want to bring into this not scripture, but rather Nietzsche. So thus spoke Zarathustra. Somewhere there are still peoples and herds, but not with us, my brethren. Here there are states. A state? What is that? Well, open now your ears unto me, for now I will say unto you my word concerning the death of peoples. A state is called the coldest of all cold monsters. Coldly lies it also, and this lie creeps from its mouth. I, the state, am the people. And so I think that a historical perspective, going back to tradition, allows us to open, at least conceptually, a space where we can see different kinds of belongings and also see how, from one kind of sort of understanding of belonging from tradition, one can criticize or think critically or think beyond identity and pride about another. But I also think, Khaled, and this I turn back to you with this, tradition is precisely that which we, in some ways, no longer have. Right? I mean, this is part of the modern condition. We can't simply jump back. Of course, people are still maintain traditions and religions, and I also introduce myself in this way. but not talking now about individual commitments, but rather talking about the world. Clearly, traditions have lost their, traditions in the way we're thinking about them here, have lost their pull. And we are in the modern world of states, including with all the negative implications of this and the loss involved in this. But this is the modern world in which we inhabit. And I think that the part of the challenge, and also the part of the challenge that Arendt posed to Zionism and to the project, was how to do that modern movement, how to embrace this modern moment which we're in, of self-fashioning, of identity, of national commitments, but in a way that would be, I think, cognizant and critical of the nation state or particular constructions of this identity and belonging.
Wow, this is really very rich. I'm not even sure how to begin responding. What would you find for me helpful to pick up? You said a lot. And you said a lot of rich things too.
You get to choose. Also, we should be mindful of time. How are we doing? Yeah, soon enough, I think we want to.
All right, so I'll take maybe 2 to 3 minutes. I mean, indeed, it's one of the formidable struggles facing us as a people in Palestine and elsewhere, to disentangle, to decouple the idea that Jewish people means Israel, right? It's one of the implicit and pernicious moves in modern Zionism to equate the two, which itself could perhaps be a form of anti-Semitism, right? But beyond this level of politics, Shai, I'm not sure I would speak about tradition in the singular. Perhaps the authority of tradition, the epistemic, the ethical, ontological, standing of tradition with big T has dwindled, has diminished. But I think our conversation would be richer, or would stay richer, should we allow for plurality of notions and senses of tradition. So let's take an example, liberalism. Liberalism, one way to understand it, as an opposition to tradition. But as scholars of the history of liberalism would know, it itself has become a tradition, the tradition of opposing tradition. In some sense, it's not necessarily the quintessential way to understand liberalism, but it's one way to understand it. But I would like to draw on other sources of thinking of tradition, from Aristotle all the way to let's say Taha Abd al-Rahman in the Arab world, or McIntyre in the Western world, but indeed including not just medievalists like Thomas Aquinas and Rambam, but also Arendt, you know, as it something we inherit, as a transmission, a conversation we inherit, a contact with beginnings. It's a tradition as a way in the present to grapple with the past, but to imagine future possibilities. All that as a tradition. So in that sense, it's hard to see any one of us outside tradition hermetically, completely, totally. Even, I would say, this way of talking about belonging is within a tradition, even though it arrives after, yes, the collapse, as Arendt would say, and the breakdown of the Roman Trinity, in her words, between authority, religion, and what was the third? Authority, religion, and freedom, excuse me, freedom. Authority, religion, and tradition. You're right, I'm mistaken. Authority, religion, and tradition. So I guess maybe to disabuse ourselves from the idea that we can think or speak ever from a tradition-free place.
Right, so I think, so obviously I agree with a lot of what you said, and I think that even the absence of tradition is a certain presence of tradition. Even the fact that and I don't want to speak in riddles, but that seeing the loss or seeing the fact that we can't reach back is not nothing. It's something that we can think about. And I think it's no coincidence that Nietzsche, when he talks about the state, speaks of the new idol, and he uses the language of idolatry to talk about this new creation. And he used this religious language, traditional language,
Yeah.
to speak of the challenges of modern society. And I think this is in the spirit also of what we're trying to get at, sort of what does it mean to try and not revive something dead, but rather to think through this question. Also in facing sort of a contemporary challenges. What does it mean to think about notions of pride, of self-fashioning, of self-determination, of identity, when what you have in mind is not the liberal subject, all-powerful, determining his future, but a question about that, and to what extent this is a true sort of understanding of who we are and where we stand. I see. Yeah.
And Shai, thank you for saying this. It is, you would agree with me, a tradition, an academic tradition, ritual, ethical tradition that we open for Q&A. We agree. So it is only right that we now turn to you so you may ask us questions, because neither Shai nor I, suppose, have said things the way we optimally want to say them, given the nature of the conversation. So it's your time to ask us, please.
First of all, thank you both very much. We're going to take a couple, maybe I'll take 2 or 3 questions, and then let you guys, we have about 10 minutes. Take 2 or 3 questions, and then let you answer.
Should I stand up, or it doesn't matter?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, Khaled, I just wanted to thank you for your contribution of looking at tradition, but I'm going to ask you a question for clarification. This is not a challenge. I'm wondering whether in your introduction of tradition, it seems like in the way you articulate it, that you're introducing another hierarchical binary, which is modernity and tradition. And so wondering about, you know, in essence, it suggests to me, since in every modernity there's tradition in my belief, and every tradition is modernity has brought in good stuff, gender equality being one of them, is the idea is that it's not to flip the hierarchy, so we put tradition on top and modernity on the bottom, and then battle, which is having more of an influence, but it's to disrupt the binary entirely, so that you see that there's the best of tradition is oftentimes in modern beliefs, and the best of modernity is also in the traditional beliefs. You get what I'm saying?
Yeah, absolutely.
So we resist doing that, flipping the binary, which we always are doing constantly on the right and the left.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I didn't, if I came across as showing a hierarchy here, implying a hierarchy between tradition and modernity, no, as a scholar of Arab poetics and Palestinian poetics, I have seen the argument made, and it makes sense to me what you say, that one need not think them conceptual analytically in the abstract, analytically as a hierarchy or as to pit them against each other. However, having said that, and why did I say it? Because some will argue, if you follow the history of Arabic poetry, a great modernity Arabic poetry enjoyed was during the Abbasid period in Baghdad. This is a disclaimer, but having said that, it's important that I be clear, and I appreciate your question. When I use the word modernity, I have in mind a very specific political, ethical, epistemic projects of which we're the products. It's not just intellectual, but it's actually a political project. Yeah.
Thank you to Khaled and to Shai. Thank you for making the trip all the way here to talk to us. And thank you for the very rich conversation. So I just need to start by asking your forgiveness, because every time you said the word tradition, I heard Tevye singing in the back of my mind.
Tevye from Fiddler, yes.
Yeah. Anyway. So what I'm wondering about is when we talk about, I mean, I am with you in this idea of sort of getting beyond a dualism, right, where we have tribalism and cosmopolitanism. But I'm wondering if what you're talking about really isn't very much the same as what the Boyarin brothers have written about, or Amnon Raz, or Judith Butler, when they talk about living as minorities among minorities, when they talk about living in exile, when they talk about living in diaspora, where exile is the act of being critical of those in power. And so one of the things I think that was missing from the conversation so far is that very question of power, right? You can care about members of your own tribe, but when you are the hegemon, then that becomes very problematic for other folks. And so I think there's a rich tradition, especially in Jewish studies. Again, Boyarin's Nono, Shaul Magid just wrote a book called Necessity of Exile, right? It sounds to me like this has something to do with what you're talking about, and I'd like to hear your comments. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll take one more question, and then I'm going to let them respond because we're going to run out of time. In the back here.
Can you take that one?
Thank you. I'm still formulating the question as I'm thinking here. I think you've answered the question of the panel in the affirmative. Tribalists can be cosmopolitan. This is a beautiful instantiation of that. Maybe the next question is, can enough tribalists be cosmopolitan to make a difference? And I'm thinking of the beautiful examples that you both discussed of praying at the Western Wall, being at Al-Aqsa Mosque, and having those connections more broadly with other traditions or with other people within your tradition. And I'm thinking about how much tension there has been and how much violence there has been at that very spot, and whether the beauty of this conversation can be translated more broadly and how that could happen. And I think maybe part of that discussion is what sorts of tribes are we talking about? And I think you were right, Shai, to mention that I think there's been some conceptual slippage in terms of what types of entities we're talking about when we talk about tribes. The discussion here has been mostly, I think, within religious traditions. There's been some reference to states and how they might not be all they're cracked up to be, but also nations. There's been reference to Palestinian nationalism, which of course includes not just Islam, but Christianity. And I'm thinking, you know, the question about power relates to this too. Netanyahu, I think, doesn't care so much about these conversations. I think Hamas doesn't care so much about these. On October 7th, there was no distinction between Jew and Muslim in terms of who was slaughtered. So how are we to turn the beauty of what you've created here today into something that will matter politically, socially for our world?
You guys have about...
So, maybe try to answer the questions, the last two questions together. I think that, at least I'll speak for myself, Khaled, you can share your thoughts. I think being critical of power is very important. I think that perhaps more important at this time, precisely because of your questions, is what does it mean to be powerful in a critical way, which is different. It's one thing to stand outside of power and criticize power. And in some ways, some of the authors you describe are actually offering that, a critical position towards power. Maybe also the relation between the prophet and the king, if we want to return to the traditions. But I think that, at least for Amnon Raz-Kakotskin, it's a different question, and I also ask it. So it's a question of, now that there is sovereignty, now that we are in a modern moment, now that there is a state, now the question becomes, so from a powerful position, but also a fragile position. So how to understand that power could come also with fragility, how to understand how to use power critically, how to understand the formation of modern states, not necessarily repeating European mistakes of the nation state, which was Hannah Arendt's question, how to bring these insights to a moment of powerfulness, not just a critique of power. And I think that, in part, I mean, it's not how to do it, but it's the kind of questions that we need to ask ourselves, not standing outside of it, criticizing it, but standing inside of it, thinking of how this can happen.
I feel I have easier time addressing your question about the repetition of this experience. I'm wondering if we ourselves are the repetition of something that has happened or has been happening for a long time, if we just expand our imagination. I do not know why, when I heard you, I thought of the experience of Malcolm X. I did think of Malcolm X being on Hajj in Mecca and how that has reshaped his relationship to black nationalism. And think of the father of my teacher, Leopold Weiss, Muhammad Asad, also in Mecca, how that has transformed his relationship to his Jewish tradition. I think of Gaza and its churches and mosques that have been erect until the recent genocidal war on Gaza. So I do not know what to say beyond that experience exists and has been existing for a long, long time.
So, first of all, please join me in thanking Shai Lavi and Khaled Furani.